We're here to talk about the roadmap to nailing your first RevOps hire. Very, very excited to get into it with you all. Taft, I do not mean to surprise you. I meant to prep you before this, but I'd love to do a quick icebreaker so the folks in our audience can get to know you a little bit better.
Okay,
my
sounds
favorite
great.
one is, what's the best day that you had recently?
Oh man, the best day that I had recently. It was actually going to Colorado with my family for the Telluride Bluegrass Festival. It turns out on the same day I was catching COVID, so
Oh, no.
but I didn't
The
know it at
best.
the time, and it was great. It was just me and my 2-year-old in a wagon walking around downtown Telluride listening to great music. That was the best day I've had.
Oh, wow. That sounds amazing. What about you, David? What's your best day you had recently?
I'd say same week. I went and visited some friends in San Luis Obispo, which, if anybody doesn't know it, it's just a kind of a postcard perfect little Central Coast California beach town.
Yes.
Wineries, beach, just a really cool little downtown area. So yeah, it's a good escape.
Love it. Love slow. I went to school in Santa Barbara, so very familiar.
Oh,
Well,
cool.
some amazing days. I don't have anything close, but really excited for you all to be here and to hear what you have to say about the roadmap to nailing your first RevOps hire. So if the folks who are in the audience today don't know, this event is brought to you by the team at Modern Sales Pros. And if you're not familiar, Modern Sales Pros, or MSP as we like to call it, is the world's largest and highest quality community for those in sales management, sales leadership, sales and RevOps, and sales enablement. We might be forgetting some folks, but those are our Modern Sales Pros. And our mission is to create an environment for our members to answer questions they might struggle to solve on their own, help them see around corners they might not even know are there. And we do that through amazing live sessions like this. We have a robust online forum, our quarterly summits, and we have in-person events again, which is really exciting. And if you are not a part of MSP, you'll be invited to join after this event. But this particular event would not be possible without the folks at Iceberg RevOps. So Taft, I'm going to pass it to you to give us a little bit about Iceberg, why you love it, what you do there, etc.
Awesome. So Iceberg is a company I founded, 5 years ago now, and we're an operations agency. We call ourselves the anti-agency, and we can get into later why that is. Excuse me, we help growing companies implement and manage a world-class tech stack with an eye toward RevOps. So within the frame of RevOps, we help companies generally growth stage. So think between founder selling and Series B or C, tool properly their tech stack for sales, marketing, and success with an eye toward strategy, and we help with the wrench work. So that's who we are at Iceberg.
Love it. Love it. So more than qualified to be talking about what you're talking about today. All right, folks,
Exactly.
Before I leave on stage and let Taft and David do their thing, just a few quick housekeeping notes. Of course, the session is being recorded. We would not let all of this wonderful information just float out into the world, never to be seen again. You'll be able to get the recording shortly after and share it with your favorite folks, with your family, if they're into RevOps like that. And we love for our events to be really interactive. David and Taft want to hear from you. They need your emojis, they need your praise, they need your commentary, and they need your questions. So please use the chat feature. You can see that I'm in there already, but I would love to see some folks. I'll give you a special shout out if I see you in there first. And you can also use the Q&A tab at the top. If you're not familiar with Goldcast, that's a great way to get really interactive with our with the audience and with our panelists as well. And we'll have a poll in just a second. So I'm going to step behind stage and I'm going to pass it to the folks, and I will see you at the very end.
Thanks, Taylor.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think in the next minute or two, Taylor's going to be pulling down the media and swapping in our deck. So while that's happening, if everyone would take a look at the poll tab in your screen, if it looks like ours, there should be the word poll as a link, and it may even pop up for you soon. Take a moment, please, and fill that out. And it looks like some answers are coming in. That's great. This may help us speak to what is going to be most meaningful for the folks who are here. We want to cater some of the messaging to the people who are actually listening. So I'm going to give it just another minute for the poll to go and for Taylor to work her magic behind the scenes. While I'm doing that, David, we didn't get an intro from you yet. And so let's, before we get started, why don't you talk about who you are, how you came to be at Iceberg, what you do?
Sure, definitely. So I've been in B2B tech sales since 2013. I started out in fintech, working for a Danish startup. But for most of my sales career has really been revolved around top of funnel, either as an SDR myself, an SDR manager, or working in sales enablement, excuse me, for outreach. Very meta. I was outreach for outreach, creating sequences and content for their SDRs to use. The way I made it to Iceberg, I worked with Taft at a previous company called PandaDoc. So long story short, I'm now head of sales here at Iceberg.
Awesome. Thanks, David. And I asked David to be here. I normally wouldn't ask someone else from Iceberg to be here at an Iceberg presentation, but David is uniquely qualified to be here and has some experience talking to, at this point, dozens, maybe hundreds of small and medium-sized companies, especially in tech, who spend entire calls telling him about their tech and ops challenges. And so I thought he had some great info to bring to bear on this presentation. So let's start out with our agenda. Let's talk about what we're going to be talking about. At the very top, this is something I'm sure many of you, I see that about half of you are in sales and a third are in operations. So a lot of people are probably also sick of talking about what is RevOps, but we just want to touch on it, and we'll dive a little deeper into why it's important to define it for the purpose of this presentation. We're going to talk about an operations maturity spectrum. So this is a concept that's been redone over and over and over. My favorite is actually was created by Taylor's boss, Pete, who created MSP and his company Atrium did a really, really thoughtful operations maturity spectrum that you should check out. Ours is a little more simple and catered to this presentation. Then we're going to talk about mistakes that people make when making their first hire. So what should you be wary of? What's the sweet spot? Who should you be looking for? And then how do you evaluate those candidates? And then some alternatives. So what are some other paths you can take if after this you're not ready to jump in with an in-house hire? So with that, let's get started. So let's jump down to the definition of RevOps. Specifically, let's talk about how RevOps is. I tell people RevOps is like AI. AI is overused and not well understood everywhere. When people say AI, it really means whatever the person saying it wants it to mean. RevOps is kind of similar. People misuse RevOps often. So in the last year or two, I've started to notice, and many of you have probably started to notice, there's a consensus forming. People's understanding and is starting to solidify. And the Clary blog, Mike Lowe at Clary, I think, put it really well. RevOps is an end-to-end business process driving predictable revenue across marketing, sales, renewals, and expansion through transparency and execution rigor. So there's a lot in there. We're not going to dive in and parse this out, but ultimately it's a centralized function that owns operations across several teams and is a total break from the classic operations paradigm where ops teams roll into their client functions. So sales ops reports into sales. That no longer exists in the RevOps paradigm. So moving on.
Sure.
A mature RevOps team. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Oh, Taft, I was going to add one thing to that piece. Something that I've heard often, and this even came up during the last MSP event that I attended in San Francisco a couple weeks ago. I've heard from people who think that RevOps also touches on issues like list provisioning or outsourced sales development. So just kind of reinforces the idea that it's still kind of a nebulous term, even though we're starting to get closer to a general consensus.
Yeah, that's a great point. And who knows, it may evolve further. I think that's entirely possible.
Mhm.
Today, I think a mature RevOps org aligns the following. So people, so think the actual reps and analysts and experts and sales and marketing and success are all rowing in the same direction. If you talk to Errol Toker at Truly, which is a company you guys should be paying attention to and someone you should be following on LinkedIn because he has a unique, interesting, really intelligent take on RevOps. This rowing in the same direction to him specifically means focused on the customer journey. Very little of his time is spent talking about tools and in-house stuff. It's all about aligning all of your resources to the customer journey, which is a super interesting take on RevOps. Process. So that's where the operational rigor comes in, creating and then holding people accountable to processes. Systems. So this is where Iceberg spends a lot of its time, process and systems. A tech stack that's centrally managed and integrated so that everyone's needs are considered in every decision. And then data and analytics. So again, centrally owned and the source of truth. And notice I'm not saying the CRM is the source of truth, but a centrally managed source of truth for all revenue data that can be helpful to ICs all the way up to the board. Go ahead, David.
A question for you, Taft. Yeah, I was wondering,
Yeah.
would you put any of these ahead of the others? Like, would you say that one of these are more important than the other, or is it just, does it just depend?
That's a really good question. I think it does depend, but specifically, I think it depends on the stage of the company. So the earlier you are, the more likely you're going to be focused on systems because that's probably the thing that hurts the most. As you become more mature, notice we're talking about a mature ops org here. There is, in terms of importance, there's less distinction between these. Any one of these, if you don't get it right, can cause a lot of pain, slow your company down. So eventually, no, there is no difference in importance, but early on, yeah, I would say systems and process are probably the more important of these. And that actually brings me to the next slide. There's a big but here. So we're talking about a first ops hire. We're not talking about a mature ops program. So keep that in mind as we go. You're going to see more of a focus on systems and process here. So you're here. There's a good chance you're just getting started trying to figure out what's next. Are you ready for an ops hire? Are you going to go the RevOps path? A qualified team can cost $1 million annually easy. So you can't tackle all of these pillars at once. So how do you prioritize? And so this brings us to the maturity spectrum. And so this is sort of our lightweight maturity spectrum, and founder selling, dedicated sales and marketing functions, and high growth are sort of the three buckets in which I place all companies. This is obviously an oversimplification. This is obviously weighted toward tech, but I think most of the people here are probably from tech. So I think this will resonate with a lot of folks listening or watching later. So what I really want to focus on here are the common ops problems. So feel free to read for a minute, digest some of this. You can look at the slides later when we send them out. So don't feel like you have to read every word of this. But specifically, I want to focus on the problems. So this is a time when companies are often implementing new CRM, marketing automation. They're really changing the core of their tech stack. They're starting to think about marketing attribution. How is our spend making its way through the funnel from top of funnel? Do we need territories? Do we need more complex lead routing than we have, which rolls over into account matching for new leads, things like that, and on and on. And so, David, I'd love to hear from you. You spend a lot of time with companies that are transitioning from founder selling to dedicated sales and marketing functions. Like, what are there more common challenges that you see that maybe aren't listed here, or ones you want to talk more about?
Sure. I think this does a good job of summarizing it, but some of the common challenges that I would highlight would be anything involving, it really comes down to anything involving transformation. That could be on the tech side, or it could be with the way that their teams are set up. On the tech piece, moving from one CRM to another is a very common challenge that I see. Adding new key integrations can also be a challenge. Reporting and forecasting, that's almost a universal gap for companies that are in this stage. And it's increasingly important as they start to, raise new funding rounds. They have boards for the first time. They have outside investors they need to think about. So external communications becomes a bigger deal. And forecasting is just notoriously difficult to get right. The way I would frame all of these issues is it's going from the earliest states where you're flying a lot by gut feel. There's a lot of subjectivity, and you're getting to the point where you're able to make more data-driven decisions. But yeah, I think those are some of the most common challenges. One other one I would call out on the people side, just adding a new outbound sales function for the first time, creating a demand gen function for the first time. These are also common transformational moments where RevOps can help.
That absolutely makes sense. So the reason we sort of highlight this one is this tends to be where companies start to think about getting an ops function. The crowdsourcing operations across sales and marketing leadership and the CEO becomes untenable. People get to a place where they spend more time firefighting and trying to figure out how to solve operational issues than doing their job. And so let's start by jumping into some common mistakes that we see when people are making their first ops hire. So let's start with timing here. This is one we see quite a bit, and waiting for unicorns. In fact, as an aside, many of Iceberg's clients, we sort of bill ourselves as a stopgap, as a bridge between founder selling and hypergrowth, and help people sort of get to a place where they can actually afford a qualified team. But a lot of companies lean on us for help hiring once they get close to hypergrowth. They're raising a B or a C round and they're ready to move on from Iceberg and do it all in-house. One thing we see often is people are waiting for unicorns, especially on the earlier side of hiring for ops. There are spectacular candidates out there. The thing to keep in mind is it is really hard to hire them. As it says here, the market for ops talent is really tight. There are ops people who can demand more in compensation than good sales reps. It's pretty incredible how tight the competition is for ops now. So some companies end up delaying a critical hire for a really long time. And unfortunately, sometimes those are companies that hire us because there's so much technical debt from waiting an extra year in search of the perfect candidate. And then you'll just find that perfect combination of tactical and strategic experience is really hard to find. And it's even harder to find somebody who has that experience and is willing to spend time in the weeds with a smaller company for their first year or two. And another one, funny enough, is hiring too early. If you don't have the resources to hire the level of talent you need to solve your problems, hiring an unqualified candidate for a critical job like operations can actually end up costing you. It'll be the most expensive money you ever saved, if that makes sense. And then let's talk a little bit about the skills that lead to mistakes. The one I use an analogy all the time. I say hiring a systems admin to run operations, which many companies do, is like hiring a plumber to build your whole house. they might do a good job at putting out fires, but they tend to fail when it comes time to think higher level, think strategy, influence their client teams, put together a holistic plan for moving the company forward. That is a huge point of failure for people who are coming from a tactical background. And it accelerates bad decisions. So if you have someone who is influenced by people who aren't ops professionals, the VP of sales is telling the new head of ops, who last week was a Salesforce administrator, just telling them what to build. All you're doing is accelerating the bad decisions that the VP of sales is happy to make because he doesn't know they're the wrong decision. Another common one in David, I seem to remember you had something to say about the admin piece.
Yeah, so the sysadmin, that second bullet in particular, one of the things that I would suggest is be really intentional about where your first RevOps hire is going to fit in your org chart, and do this so that they can basically operate independently. A lot of times the default is for a RevOps hire to report to a head of sales, which kind of defeats the purpose of eliminating silos. But I think we'll probably get more into that later on as well.
Yeah, that's a great call. Another one I see is the opposite end of the spectrum. And this is, you see this often in sales, also hiring a seasoned executive who doesn't have recent hands-on experience. They know what to do, but they don't know how the sausage is made. And I've seen this play out over and over again, where someone who is a great strategist, but there's a huge gap when it comes to implementing any of his or her ideas. And so this one can be really costly because you might end up having way more strategic firepower than you need right now. And you end up spending a bunch of money bringing in admins to fill the gap that a more well-rounded, maybe even if less experienced hire would be able to fill, herself. So that's another thing to watch out for. So we've talked about some mistakes. We've talked about sort of what to avoid. So let's talk about what your options are at a high level. And we can breeze through this one. So you can hire a leader and let them build. That can be a tough one because qualified leaders are expensive, and finding someone who's strategically qualified but able to do some of the wrench work early on and is willing to do it can be tough. Hire an individual contributor and a leader later. That's great if you have somebody qualified to manage and develop them, and we'll talk a lot more about that in the next slide or next couple slides. Or hire the whole team at once, which that's great if you can do it, if you have the resources and you can time it. But the chances are, if you're in a position where you're making your first ops hire, making the jump to hiring a whole team is a pretty big leap. And go ahead, David.
I was wondering, what about just looking for ad hoc work done, say through like an Upwork contractor?
That's a great question. So over the years, I've hired from Upwork many times. I've actually found people on Upwork I've worked with on a project and said, "Oh my gosh, you're good." And I've tried to hire them full time. A couple of our Iceberg people are people who who in previous roles at PandaDoc and Smart Recruiters were Upworkers who I recruited after. So while there are people who are pretty amazing on Upwork, I've also found that I got to hire 5 people to get one I trust on Upwork. So there's an element of sort of gamble there that makes it a little scary. Another is we're talking about contractors. We're talking about people who have probably a lot of irons in the fire or a full-time day job. So depending on the size of the project, if you're considering making a full-time ops hire, there's a lot of risk in going to Upwork. Even if you find somebody great, they may not be available in a month and you might be starting all over. So there are times when it works out well, but I would be careful about that one.
Cool.
So let's talk about the why we start with a leader here. So somehow I think I skipped a slide, but we choose we almost all of our clients who come to us and say we're ready to build an ops team, what do we do? We tell almost all of them start with a leader. With rare exceptions, we'll tell them it's time to get a leader and let them build a team around them. And why we start with a leader, someone with experience, is the Dunning-Kruger effect. So those of you who aren't familiar with this, Dunning-Kruger effect is the idea that the people who are the most confident are the most experienced and the least experienced. The people who are the least experienced often don't know what they don't know, and so they don't actually know their shortcomings. They don't know where their gaps are. They're super confident and can often charge really hard in the wrong direction without realizing it. And I dropped this green arrow in here to represent where, in my experience, most VPs of sales and marketing fall. These are really smart people. These are, this isn't to speak to their intelligence so much as experience. I don't think I've ever sold to a VP of sales who didn't at some point tell me, oh, I have an ops background. And often how they define that is, well, I used Salesforce for like 6 years. So like I have an ops background. I'm a power user. And so having that experience, but not enough to fall in the average person trough of the Dunning-Kruger effect, means that often they're gonna struggle to develop or guide your individual contributors in the right direction. It's not uncommon for us to come in and start working with a company and realize, oh, that awful ops person who you just fired after a year probably wasn't their fault that everything is on fire now. A lot of times they've spent the last year building exactly what the VPs of sales and marketing told them to build, and then everyone is confused as to why nothing works the way anyone expects. And often it's because they were order taking from people who were on the left side of this graph, and by definition, if you're there, you don't know it. So that is one reason we tell people to start with leaders. So let's move on. So we've decided it makes sense to hire, and let's assume you're willing to start with a leader. So for the rest of this presentation, that's what we're focusing on, helping you make a good choice when you're hiring your first leader. Of course, that's not the only choice. There are situations where it makes sense to go in a different direction. But for the purpose of this presentation, focus is choosing what not to focus on. So we are focusing pretty narrowly on talking about hiring a leader first. So let's move to the next one. And David, I believe you're up.
Sure. All right. Yeah. So in terms of, what should you look for in a first? Oh, my apologies. First time using Goldcast. But getting back to what's your ideal first RevOps hire going to look like? Sorry, this is delayed. I'm going to leave this to you, Taft, if you don't mind.
Yep, I gotcha.
So what to look for in your first RevOps hire? Number one is just you want to make sure that they can speak to both tactical and strategic challenges. We mentioned this earlier. I think it really bears repeating. Your first RevOps hire, they absolutely need to understand the core tools that you're using. Those are table stakes. But they should also have experience driving business outcomes. And what we mean by that is make sure that they're not narrowly focused on a task at hand, that they have really every go-to-market function in mind whenever they're making decisions. The second point is just make sure they have a point of view on how to run projects. That means, do they have a background in more agile methodology, or are they more wedded to like a waterfall method? Have they had to exercise prioritization? do testing before deployment? And do they have any ideas on just how to train and enable your sales and marketing customer success teams? And then last is, this is kind of universal, regardless of the role. Just make sure they know how to work with all the different levels in your organization. They need to have the confidence to speak to folks who are at the top of the org chart, to ask them tough questions, diplomatically challenge the status quo, and once again, be willing to say no. That's something that is one of the key differentiators between a novice in ops and somebody who has some experience. But I had a question for Taft, though. Like, with this understanding that your first RevOps hire should have a mix of tactical and strategic experience, we want to make sure that we're not still looking for unicorns here. So how should a company just decide, like, what's the relative importance between more of a tactical background or more of a business outcomes strategic background?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the answer to this one requires you to look around at the rest of your team. So by whom will this new hire be surrounded? So if they're going to work at Gated, where Andy Moat, who is one of my favorite ops leaders, who came from an ops role previously and is a really thoughtful leader in the ops space. If you're working for Andy or Brad Smith, if you go to work at Sonar, you're going to be working for somebody who actually is a deeply experienced ops person. I think it's okay for them to shift a little more tactical because they're going to be developed. They're going to have someone who is on the very right side of that Dunning-Kruger graph. And so if in that case, you can get away with more tactical. But if you don't have an Andy or a Brad, or if, you know, in the past when I've been a VP of sales, if there's not somebody like me who has deep ops experience there to help them, then you need to cheat more towards strategic. They need to be a little slower and more thoughtful about what they roll out, able to think through challenges and challenge the VPs of sales and marketing and success who are throwing solutions to problems that haven't been well defined at them. So that's how I would think about that.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, my pleasure. So I'm gonna kind of leave this up here for a minute, let you guys read it, and then I'll give you about 5 seconds here, and then we'll talk through it. So this graph came into existence because some of our clients were asking me, you know, who do I hire? We're ready to hire in-house. What do we do? And because I'm a visual learner and it helps me to draw things, I created this. As you can see, the vertical axis is technical skills, horizontal is strategic skills, and I've sort of made quadrants here. And so I've sort of drawn where your first hire should probably be. And this depends where in that green area you should fall, depends on what we just talked about. Like, do they have people to help them develop as a strategic leader, or do you need somebody more strategic and then you get them tactical help early? But this is a good thing to digest if you're starting to think through your first hire, and you need to think about plotting candidates against this. And, you know, if the top right corner too expensive isn't the case for you, if you're, you know, early stage but raised a ton of money and are willing to spend it, then erase that one. Then absolutely, if you can get a high B, somebody in the top right corner of this and afford them and find them and hire them, you should. But for most companies, that area is too expensive. You're looking at sort of a minimum of $200K, all the way up into the, you know, 300s for somebody who's very tactically sound with a lot of strategic experience. And I would definitely avoid the too tactical and the too hands off. Those are some of the sort of areas we mentioned earlier to avoid. So hopefully this is helpful for other visual learners to think about plotting people on the chart. And so I guess let's move on to actually evaluating hires. So the things we're going to talk about, the two skills, systems knowledge and experience, and strategic thinking and consulting. Keep in mind that these are in addition to all of the other things you should be testing: cultural fit, drive, desire for the position, things like that. But specific to this role, these are the sort of two things we're gonna talk to you about testing. I also want to pause for a minute here. I think this is a really really important note, which is why I named it important note. RevOps is a lot more than systems, but in this narrow scenario, you're graduating from no ops program to hiring your first in-house ops person or people. It's okay to focus a little more on systems than one might do a little later, when RevOps to you might mean enablement and things that are a lot more than just systems. But early on, chances are they're going to be focused on just getting your systems out of the critical path, because for most companies, the ones we talk to, and David, maybe you can speak to this, a lot of them are hobbled by technical debt around the time they start thinking about either hiring an agency or a full-time ops person.
Yeah, I've definitely seen there's this there's this tendency to delay making your first ops hire, because it doesn't have as much of an immediate impact on your funnel, or it's not as obvious. I think sales tends to be the first function that's hired, if not sales, then marketing. But yeah, that technical debt does tend to accumulate just because RevOps is often hired later than they should be.
So let's jump to the next one. Systems knowledge and experience. This is really important, but we're sort of going to gloss over it. And the reason for that is tech stacks are constantly changing and they're different at every org. So it's really hard for me to give you blanket advice when I don't even know which CRM you use. There are several options that are totally valid that you might be using. But you do want to make sure that they have at least familiarity with your basic tech stack. Somebody who has never used HubSpot is going to have a much longer learning curve if you're a HubSpot shop than somebody who has at the very least been a power user, preferably has had some experience in the back end of HubSpot. And the same goes for Salesforce and any other system we talk about. But CRM, marketing automation, and sales automation for most tech companies are sort of the big three when it comes to the core of your stack. And there are others. There are, if you have Tatango, it might be something that you want to make sure they at least understand what it is and have seen the inside of it before. And if you don't have these yet, don't sweat it. That's not actually a problem. And in some cases, it might open up your candidate pool more. So don't worry if you don't have them, but if you do, make sure they have a basic level of understanding. And for most CRMs, that's a certification level. I say constantly at Iceberg that a 201, a Salesforce admin 201 certification, which is sort of the base level certification, that and $1 will get you a cup of coffee. So do a little research, find out what the certifications they have actually mean. But that's a good test for having at least a basic level of knowledge. And so that brings us to, I think, the most important part of this. We buried the lead a little bit here, but I think this was all important to get to scenario-based interviews. So at Iceberg, we hire consultants, and these consultants are sort of the core of our business. They are our ops leaders. And so we rely really heavily on interviews that include scenarios, and we do it early in our process. There is no more reliable an indicator of future success as a consultant, or using that as a proxy for ops leader, than scenarios. And so as soon as they pass a resume review and a phone screening, we go straight to 2 scenarios, one of which we're gonna show you here today. So let's talk through these. So first, let's just share the scenario, and I'll send this out you feel free to steal this, make it your own, use it word for word, whatever you like. It's yours to use, and we'll actually talk through how to grade this. So we send a few minutes ahead of the interview, we send the candidate, we let them know there's a scenario coming, we send it to them, give them a few minutes to digest it, and then hop on the phone and talk through it. So the scenario is you've received this email from a VP of sales, and now you're in a meeting, and usually I play the VP of sales and they play the ops leader, and we have a discussion about the email that I just sent. So I'll pause for a second. Instead of reading it for you, I'll give you a second to read it, and I'll give you to a count of 10 to sort of absorb this. Okay. So hopefully you've had the time to read. The voice in my head is like the classic like caricature of a sales leader. It's like, hey, shooter, need a hand, go do this thing, get it back to me in an hour. Thanks, bud. And that's sort of the vibe I try to give and use during this scenario. And I want them to feel the pushiness, because you're going to get that, and not necessarily from sales leaders. It can come from marketing or success leaders. But often you get people who are deeply confident that they know the answer. And so let's talk about what we're actually testing here. At first glance, yeah, it sounds like we're testing their admin skills. Like, can you do this thing? But we are not. And don't tell them this. This is a great way to find out where they fall on that chart. Don't tell them what you're actually testing for here. Just start the scenario. We want to understand their strategic skill set. And we do that by giving them the answer. David, one of the things that you and I have talked about a bunch in sales, prescription.
Oh, yeah. What was it? Diagnosis before prescription is malpractice. Is that it?
It's the opposite. Prescription
before diagnosis is malpractice.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we're giving them an opportunity to trip over themselves here. And so we're testing their ability to handle a situation where somebody just gives them the prescription. This is like somebody walking into the doctor's office and being like, hey, I need Percocet. Mm-hmm. Well, what's wrong? What hurts? And so we want to find out how good a doctor they are in this analogy. And remember Dunning-Kruger effect. So Dave, the person in this scenario, is a walking Dunning-Kruger graph. Here are some immediate disqualifications. And I'm actually going to start with an anecdote here. A year or so ago, I thought I had found a unicorn who I was hiring for an ops role. I was sure the resume was perfect. Answers were really good. I asked a lot of philosophy questions in the phone screen and said all the right things. And we got to the scenario and we went over the email, and he immediately said like, oh yeah. And these first two bullets are like his answer to me. Oh yeah. Salesforce can handle this. So I just, blah, blah, blah. And then he jumped straight into like clarifying questions like, which users should be able to access this checkbox. And that was an immediate disqualification for me. He didn't make it past that round. Other things you should be listening for, like, hey, what dashboards do I need to update? Anything that tells you they are thinking of this as a task they've been assigned is an immediate disqualifier. That person is not ready to be your ops leader, and you will be in trouble if you hire this person and then put them in charge of operations. Give them the keys to your systems and all of your processes, and ask them to grow a program. So
just real quick, there was one other thing I saw there that I think is a good red flag. Just the idea of, it doesn't seem like they really had the end user in mind. They're asking the Salesforce user, the AE, to really answer the same question twice. Is this is this deal part of pipeline? So it's a little bit tactical, but I think it's a good example of just something to, listen for. Make sure that they understand like what the day-to-day is going to be for your sales, marketing, or CS teams who are using the stack.
That's a really, really good call out. I'm going to talk about Errol again. He sort of a year or two ago turned me on to this idea that the best ops people are really, especially when it comes to systems. So the sort of systems management side of ops, the best ops people are product managers. And that's absolutely right. If they answer it like an engineer and think about what is and isn't possible and how do we quickly build this thing without ever considering like, will the end user benefit from this? Great call out. That's another immediate disqualifier. Mm-hmm. So what does good look like? So the best candidates for this, the people who I try very hard to hire, are the ones who, first of all, they don't challenge or accept the proposed solution. What they do is they get deeply curious. They seek to understand what's beneath the ask. So they start asking lots of questions. What do you mean they're struggling to manage with pipeline management? Which AEs have, are there specific AEs who are struggling with this, or is it all of them? How do they manage pipeline today? How have you been doing it for the last few years? How did you come to this solution? Like, tell me your thought process. And so I really, really like to see bonus points for someone who educates me as the mock VP of sales. As David just said, like the checkbox idea is recreating something that already exists, but just isn't obvious. And so in Salesforce, if they have some exposure to Salesforce, even if they're not a professional admin, if they're an ops person who's worked with Salesforce for a while, they should know that this is not an appropriate approach because Salesforce already does this, and here's how it does it. And why don't we set up a demo of how forecasting works, and maybe I can explain to you the architecture of the opportunity object so that we can use what's already there to accomplish what you've explained to me is the problem after lots of questions. That actually leads me to an article that I wrote for Sales Hacker years ago now, but every once in a while someone pings me about it. Saying no is a critical skill for ops professionals, and I actually wrote this with my wife, who is a psychiatrist, and most of it is quoting her on how to say no and like thoughtful strategies for saying no that avoid conflict, but also don't require you to back down or give in. So, really good resource that will be linked when we send out the presentation. So let's jump down and talk about some alternatives for growing companies. And we're bordering on shameless pitch territory, but we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the fact that there is another path. Instead of hiring an in-house ops team when you're looking to bridge that gap between founder selling and hypergrowth, agencies are an option, and an option that are, I think a few years ago, they weren't a very good option because most of them were specific to a certain piece of technology. So they were a Salesforce shop or a HubSpot shop, and they were primarily a technical resource or a single project resource. But over the years, there are more agencies like Iceberg that focus on actually being your ops team. So the times when this makes sense, and these are some questions you should ask yourself. Do you need a range of skills? If you have a big tech stack or a tech stack that needs several integrations and no single skill will get that done, then maybe it makes sense to talk to agencies also. Ops is critical. You have to have ops now, but you don't know if there's 40 hours a week or 80 hours a week if you end up with a leader and an admin. There's not that much work to be done, and while it's more costly per hour, might be a lot more efficient and ultimately cheaper to talk to an agency about getting fractional access to a team that's world class. Or budget constraints. Again, for the cost of an admin, there are several reputable agencies out there that can actually lend a hand. And so let's talk about actually evaluating a consultancy. So David, you put this in when we were preparing the deck, so maybe you can speak a little bit to this, but yeah, with a detailed understanding of your goals and challenges.
Definitely. So I'd say number one, exactly that. You want to make sure that a consultancy that you're speaking with, they aren't asking questions that are overly tactical, that they do seek to understand what are the business outcomes that you're looking for. Number two is just making sure that you're able to communicate well. I think an ideal engagement with a consultancy feels almost more like staff augmentation. An issue that I've seen crop up with some consultancies is that they'll do the work, they'll go away, and then a year later, nobody really knows on a granular level what was done. So make sure that documentation is going to be available. Also, following an agile methodology, I think for companies that are still scaling, I think this is essential because priorities can shift from quarter to quarter. And you just need to be able to have that agile approach to solving problems. If you're an enterprise company, then you can go ahead and hire a McKinsey who will, go away for 90 days, come back with a 1,000-page PDF. But that's not really, who we're talking about here. And then just last, I would include ask questions about, who are these folks in your teams? Ask about like what's their turnover. That's a good indicator for how well they're treating their employees, and that translates into just better work overall. I would also ask, like, are they contracting out their staff themselves, which is pretty common, or are they all full-time employees? So that I think can speak to like how cohesive the teams are, how well they work together. The better they work together, the better they'll work for you. So yeah, just a few top of mind points.
Yeah, and if you care about this stuff, which I mean, at Iceberg, we care pretty deeply about, and we know some great agencies that are in our space that do as well. You should be asking, like, do your employees get health benefits? Are they W-2? These things matter, A, because they just should matter for the sake of the people working there, and B, because it impacts you directly. So keep that in mind if you go the agency route. And then some things to be cautious of. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, but offshoring work. Iceberg has an employee in South Africa, so offshore isn't by definition bad, but there's a difference between having employees or a team overseas that works for you versus using contractors who are overseas for pennies on the dollar. In a lot of cases, you get what you pay for, and you end up with a lower hourly rate and way more hours to get things done right, if they're ever done right. People who assign admins as the primary contact, lots of agencies, because there's very low barrier to entry in our world. Plenty of agencies start up, few get to a place where they're stable, steady companies. And a lot of them start by taking an admin and making that admin the primary point of contact, your account manager, your project manager, they're the support person. You actually end up in the same place as you would have ended up had you hired an admin to be your first ops hire. And then waterfall methodology. I think this is pretty tightly related to what David said about one of the big four consulting companies coming in and creating a big PDF of what needs to be done. If you're a big business or a business with really clear requirements, and you already know exactly what needs to be done, and that's not going to change, which is never the case for growing sort of fast moving companies, that's fine. But but chances are you need a level of agility that waterfall doesn't allow. So be careful about that if you're going the agency route.
Taft, I was wondering about that second bullet.
Yeah.
Like, what's the alternative to that?
The second bullet. Back? So the alternative, that's a good question. So, well, I mean, I'll just tell you what we do at Iceberg. So you need a project manager over time. You can maybe get away with this for small tasks and stuff, but if you want someone to own business outcomes, you need a strategist, you need a project manager, you need somebody keeping the trains running on time, and you probably need a diverse skill set. So with the proliferation of tools that has followed, all the new strategies in sales and marketing, account-based everything, it comes to mind. Chances are there are going to be lots of tools. Some integrations are going to be required to, update a tech stack, to modernize it, to align with these, to A, align with the RevOps framework, and B, align with the strategies like account-based everything. An admin is really going to struggle, even if they're the world's greatest admin and they can do administration on Marketo, Salesforce, Lean Data, Outreach, and all of your other tools. It doesn't leave a lot of bandwidth for reporting up the ladder, how things are going, thinking about how it should all fit together, and on and on. So project management and strategy are the two pieces that are missing there that you really need to have in place to be successful at building a world-class tech stack, processes, and ultimately ops program. All right, so wrapping up here, you're going to get a copy of this deck. There are going to be links in it, and there are a couple links in the deck, and we may put together more stuff for you if there are reference material that needs to go along with it. And then this deck is based on a much more detailed white paper that is coming out of design in the next few days. And so in the next week or so, we're going to email it out to this list. So you'll actually get a hard copy of the white paper that goes in more detail here. I realize we ran down the clock on you. If there are any questions, feel free to add them in the Q&A. I think we can hang out for another minute here, see if any pop up, and if not, we can wrap up.
Here, in case any questions come up.
I did see one question in the chat at the very beginning, Taft. Someone asked, I think it was like within the first 5 slides, you had suggested someone to follow on LinkedIn who's has a fresh take on RevOps. That was for Kim Hargrove. Who was that person again?
Yeah, that was Errol Toker from Truly, EROL. Follow him. He spends a lot of time writing on LinkedIn, but it's not the clickbaity sort of light stuff that you see a lot of people writing. It's very thoughtful, very intelligent stuff that is specific to RevOps, because he's building a product in RevOps and building a following, but doing it in a way that I think adds tons of value to people who are listening.
I just popped his LinkedIn. We also are going to get cut off by Goldcast in about 40 seconds. So I want to say a huge thank you to David and Tash for dropping all of this knowledge today. I can't wait to get all the links that you're going to send out to folks. And if you do have follow-up questions, David and Taft's LinkedIns are in the chat, so you can copy those and send them a message as well. Huge thank you to you all for coming out on a Tuesday, and we hope to see you at another MSP event soon. Bye, everyone.